Give the people what they want. We'll hear the yes and no cases for referendums. And another vital vote, why you get to choose between a card game, a horror classic, and a big monkey throwing barrels. I'm Martin Stanford. This is Insight. Welcome to Insight. Giving the people what they want has never seemed so popular. Britain is leaving the EU because of a referendum. Scotland could leave Britain if it has another one. Italy got shocked by the results of one, Turkey has one next month, and Ireland's held 8 in the past 7 years. So here's our Insight referendum question. Are they really driven by a desire by politicians to fulfil the will of the people? We'll hear the cases for yes and no in a moment. First, Insight's Ty Genwright has our main report, focusing on a country where they have them all the time.
Welcome to Switzerland, land of the never-endum. This country is built on direct democracy. Usually there are several referendums every year. The latest last month saw a majority vote not to abandon nuclear power. And the number of Swiss who actually take part, on average, is just under half.
In general, I still vote, but this time I found that the stakes were particularly important.
In recent years, the Swiss have also voted on topics as varied as building a new road tunnel and a universal income for all its citizens. It's part of this country's history, dating back to the 19th century, when the modern constitution was written at a time of division between conservatives and liberals, Catholics and Protestants, and people who spoke 3 major languages. As in most countries, referendums are triggered in Switzerland if there's a proposed change to the constitution. That's an obligatory referendum. But an ordinary citizen can also challenge a new law and trigger a referendum if they can get 50,000 fellow citizens to sign a petition. This is a voluntary referendum. And if an ordinary citizen gets 100,000 signatures on a petition, he or she can propose a new law by referendum. This is called an initiative.
There are medieval precedents in what is known as Landsgemeinde, that is open-air meetings. I mean, if I point to there is a postcard over there showing one. Decisions were made. You know, anyone who lived there came, it had to be a man, mark you. You put your hand up and you voted. Cantons began to experiment with that kind of rule because they got a bit fed up with being kicked around by the elite.
Is there such a thing as Swiss referendum fatigue?
Yeah, people do get fed up. A lot of people, you know, do find it a bit of a chore. But on the other hand, they absolutely adore it as a sign of national identity and a national democracy and sovereignty.
It was to Switzerland that the British Prime Minister Theresa May escaped for a quick holiday shortly after last year's referendum on leaving the European Union. The Brexit vote was the 3rd ever to be held across the UK as a whole. Referendums are extremely rare in Britain because it does not have a written constitution. It makes its laws, like most countries, by representative or indirect democracy, in which voters elect lawmakers to make decisions on their behalves.
When a referendum has been proposed by the government, is there a chance that voters treat it as a vote of confidence in that government rather than the issue of the day?
Yes, I think that's very much so. People do tend to vote on what is on their minds. General de Gaulle, who made a great and successful use of referendum, once remarked the problem with referendum is that you ask the people a question but they answer another one.
Well, indeed, referendums in Britain are not actually legally binding, and that means that the members of this Parliament could ultimately vote to ignore the choice made by ordinary voters in their referendum last year.
It could be argued direct democracy doesn't exist here, although Britain has just made one of its biggest ever decisions in this way. Ty Genwright reporting for Insight in London.
Well, to discuss that further, I'm joined now by Stephen Barber, who's the Associate Professor of Public Policy at the London South Bank University. Stephen, welcome. This is the proposition we're going to put to you. You can have a yes or no vote, and that is, are referendum often driven by a desire of politicians to fulfil the will of the people? Do they have that noble intent?
I think they can do, but I think what's underlying your question there is the opposite true as well, and that certainly can be the case. And the experience that we've had here in Britain with the European referendum, if you look at the motivations for that, it was David Cameron's speech in 2013, the Bloomberg speech, which set out the intention of having an in-out referendum. Well, the motivation for that was clearly domestic and party politics. UKIP, the UK Independence Party, the very anti-European party, breathing down his neck in marginal constituencies with an election approaching. David Cameron must have felt that the chances of him actually having to hold a referendum were pretty slim. Britain hadn't elected a majority Conservative government since 1992. He was likely to be in a coalition with the Liberal Democrats, and they would have blocked it.
So it was political expediency. It was nothing as noble as having let the people have their say.
I think in that case it's very difficult to say that that was a very noble intention. It was very domestic party political.
Other countries, of course, do use referendums, we've heard, much more frequently. Do the voters get tired of this? After all, most democracies have a process whereby every few years you vote on the policies of this lot or that lot, you put them in power, and then don't we as an electorate kind of want to sit back and say, well, get on with it?
Yeah. Well, you're contrasting there, as you reported, the difference between direct democracy, and that's what a referendum is. You ask the people to make a decision on a particular issue, and representative democracy. You elect people to Parliament to represent you and to decide on those issues. The problem is, I think, that very often direct democracy is incompatible with direct democracy, with representative democracy, because it not only produces irresponsible government, it means that they give up not just the power over an issue, but also the responsibility. The people,
irresponsible government.
I think it can do.
It means them lazy as politicians, does it?
I mean, lazy is a different sort of word, but I think you could find a situation, and we may well be in it in Britain now, where the people have explicitly rejected the advice of government and of Parliament, and yet Parliament now has to carry out that will. And so it's doing something that is against the advice and the better judgment of those politicians.
And do you think the margin of a victory, one way or another, can actually help a cause, or, on the opposite case, actually make matters worse? I mean, I'm thinking, without obsessing about our own situation here in Britain, other decisions have been on a knife edge. And of course, in a democracy, you then have to acknowledge, OK, you won by whatever it was, 0.3%. But that doesn't really settle the result, doesn't it? Because the number of disappointed people are almost the same as the number of...
Sure, and you raise a number of issues there. I mean, the first one is, again, well, actually, some countries, when they hold a referendum, will have a minimum threshold which you'll have to hit in order for the thing to... Is that a
better system, do you think?
Not necessarily, because you're still left with the problem, again, of comparing direct democracy with representative democracy. And that is that when you have representative democracy, there is a winner and there is a loser. But the losing side is also represented in that parliament. So in a parliamentary system, you will have the winning side, which forms a government, but very often the losing side forms the opposition and continues to represent the views of those who have lost. In a referendum, it kind of tends to be winner takes all. Yeah. And the reason and the problem with that is that you never settle an issue. If we go back to the first time that Britain voted on membership of what's now the European Union, back in 1975, very famous politician Tony Benn was very much in favour of it because he said it would get it out of our system. Well, it didn't. His own party was in favour of withdrawal from Europe within a parliament. We've had a vote on Scottish independence, as you alluded to there, barely 2 years ago, and we're talking about another one. We're already talking about the possibility of a second European referendum. So these things don't really go away.
And they do clog up the political process, don't they? Because arguing the case, campaigns, television advertising, debates, whatever it is, it paralyses the process of government for those involved.
It does, and there's a question there of whether you allow government to suspend collective responsibility, whether you allow politicians from the same party and the same government to argue on either side. And it also raises a broader criticism of referendums, and that is that while they might be characterised as giving the people the opportunity to look at a particular issue, it's only a binary choice, remember, it's yes or no, one way or the other. Those who lead the campaigns on either side are not engaging in some sort of civic education program. They're not trying to educate the population around the real complexities of those issues. They're trying to win votes. So it's about votes, not voice.
I was going to ask you about that. So many issues are far too complex, actually, to be distilled down to that binary choice, aren't they? And then let me ask you about, though, whether the margin of win or the margin of participation actually gives a referendum any kind of merit or otherwise. I mean, some cases, referendums, only 30% of the electorate take part, 40%. If it's up in the 70s or 80s, do you think that is a legitimate outcome?
I think that when you sit back and you analyse those things, clearly the more people that take part and the greater margin gives something a greater legitimacy.
Yes, but it feels like a decision has been made.
It feels like it. Unfortunately, I think in democracies, a win is a win is a win is a win.
Yes.
You know, if decisions are made by those who turn up, and if you've got more votes than your opponent, you've won that vote.
I mean, the slightly absurd point of this, and comparisons were made about the engagement of electorates in that whole democratic process and regular elections and so on, is the television sort of game show formats where you can engage maybe half a population, 2/3 of a population might actually pick up the telephone or use their smartphone or whatever it is. Do politicians need to get smarter at this? And if they really want to put decisions to the people, do you do it via a website and a click?
I think clearly politicians have to and are engaging in modern ways of communication, social media, television, radio, and all the rest. But the premise of your question really puts the emphasis there on the politicians. Actually, if people are voting on a particular issue, maybe there's more responsibility on people, not just for expressing a vote one way or the other, but also taking responsibility for the outcome of that vote, for the repercussions of that vote. And unfortunately, we haven't seen that, certainly in the referendum here in Britain. Perhaps you'll see that in democracies like Switzerland that you talked about in the film, which have much more of a culture of making these sorts of decisions.
Yeah, is there something to learn? I mean, in America, most, of course, the statewide things are not referendums on a national scale. I don't think has ever been that. But some of the states, I'm thinking California particularly, they often, at election cycle, coinciding with a general election or whatever it might be, they often ask people what they think about this, that and the other. But that often gets some rather bizarre results.
Yes, I mean, California's a great example of this. They have these things called propositions rather than referendums, but they're very similar. Actually, it shows another great weakness of a referendum, that if you're asking people to vote on particular issues rather than a range of things, you can end up with things that contradict. So, I mean, it's not quite as crude as this, but Californians have voted for both tax cuts and spending rises. Not quite as crude as that, but you can see the problem with the
mutually contradictory policies, which any politician, if they were espousing this on their own, would never get away with it.
That's right, because it doesn't add up.
Yeah.
And that's a fundamental problem of using these in that unstrategic way.
OK, Stephen, good to talk to you. Thank you very much indeed. This is Inside. Coming next, what's your favourite game of all time? Find out if it could make it into the World Video Game Hall of Fame this year.